Listen carefully, Chosen One, because what I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you thought you understood about the game being played around you. Right now, as we speak, there's a conversation happening in a room you've never seen between people who thought they had buried you so deep you'd never surface again. But here's what they don't know yet, and what you're about to discover. Their entire foundation is cracking, and you're the earthquake they never saw coming. Someone very close to your situation is about to make a move that will send shockwaves through every person who ever doubted you. But before I tell you who it is and why they're switching sides, you need to understand the three simultaneous wars being fought for your soul right now. The first war is happening in the spiritual realm, where forces have been positioning for this exact moment. The second war is playing out in the minds of people who are discovering that everything they believed about power was a lie. And the third war, the most dangerous one, is the battle between your old identity and the cosmic force you're becoming. But there's something else, something darker that's been building in the shadows while you've been enduring their attacks. Someone who stood in the inner circle, someone who helped orchestrate your exile, has been experiencing something that's driving them to the edge of madness. They can't sleep, they can't focus, and what they're about to confess will expose a conspiracy so twisted that even you won't see it coming. What they never told you, what they couldn't admit even to themselves, is that they weren't just trying to silence you because they disagreed with your message. They were trying to silence you because deep down they knew you were right about everything, and your accuracy terrified them more than any external threat ever could. Your predictions weren't just hitting the mark, they were revealing that the entire foundation of their reality was built on quicksand. Now here's the twist that changes everything about their motivation. They weren't afraid of you being wrong. They were afraid of you being so consistently right that people would start asking questions about how you could see what was coming when all their experts, all their advisors, all their trusted sources were blind to the obvious. Your prophetic accuracy was exposing their incompetence, their reliance on false information, and their complete disconnection from any real source of wisdom. Tremors started when they began noticing the impossible accuracy of everything you'd predicted. Well, those words are now prophecy manifest, and they're scrambling to find the notes they took while publicly mocking you. But here's the twist that's about to change everything. One of them never threw those notes away, and what they've discovered in their own handwriting is about to flip this entire narrative on its head. While they were performing their skepticism for the crowd, you were documenting something else entirely, something that would make them realize they weren't just wrong about you, they were wrong about the fundamental nature of reality itself. Because what you saw coming wasn't just their downfall, what you saw was the complete inversion of every power structure they thought was permanent. But here's what will shake you to your core. Your silence during all their attacks wasn't passivity, it was surgical precision. Every moment you chose not to defend yourself, not to react, not to justify your position, you were making calculated moves that would later prove devastating to their entire operation. They thought your silence meant weakness, that you didn't have the strength to fight back. What they never realized is that you were studying them, cataloging their methods, watching how they moved when they thought you were down. Your silence made them nervous in ways they couldn't articulate, and that's exactly why they kept trying to provoke reactions from you. They needed you to break, to lash out, to give them something they could use against you. But you never gave them what they needed because you understood something they didn't. That truth doesn't need to argue for its existence. Truth simply waits, and time always reveals what's real. Every attack they launched, every lie they spread, every attempt to undermine your credibility was being recorded by forces they couldn't see, not just in the spiritual realm, but in the fabric of reality itself. Because when you operate from authentic power, the universe itself becomes your ally, documenting every injustice, every betrayal, every moment of truth being suppressed for a reckoning that would make their worst fears look like gentle corrections. But there's a fourth element that nobody talks about, and it's the most explosive part. Someone on the inside has been playing a double game from the beginning. They helped fuel the opposition against you, yes, but not for the reasons anyone thinks. What they were actually doing was so sophisticated, so many levels deep, that even you don't know their true identity yet. But you're about to. Trompedenti. Lightning struck their consciousness when they realized you hadn't been trying to join their table. You had been building a completely different structure, one that operated on principles they couldn't fathom because they were still playing checkers while you were architecting dimensions. Their gatekeeping meant nothing because you weren't seeking entry. You were creating entry points they didn't even know existed. This sent seismic shocks through their carefully constructed hierarchies because it meant their control was an illusion maintained through collective delusion. But illusions require constant energy to maintain, and that energy was being drained by a force they couldn't identify. That force was you, pulling their foundation into your gravitational field without them realizing it was happening. But there's something else about your presence that's been driving them to the edge of madness, something they can't admit even to themselves. Every time they stood near you, something in their cellular structure would activate. Your frequency wasn't just affecting their thoughts or emotions, it was literally upgrading their DNA, awakening dormant codes that connected them to their highest potential. And their egos were fighting this activation with everything they had because it meant the death of who they thought they were. You see, you weren't just different from them, you were what they could become if they had the courage to surrender their false identities. Your very existence was a mirror showing them their own untapped divinity, and instead of embracing the upgrade, they chose to attack the mirror. They convinced themselves that destroying your reflection would somehow protect them from having to face their own transformation. This is why your presence made them so uncomfortable. It wasn't intimidation they were feeling, it was conviction. Your energy was literally forcing them to choose between evolution and stagnation, between truth and comfortable lies, between their authentic selves and the personas they had built to survive in a world that rewards pretending. Most of them chose the comfort of their cages, but the universe was keeping score of every choice, and payment was coming due. Now here's where everything takes its first major turn, and why someone is about to switch sides in the most dramatic way possible. They've discovered that every time they attacked you, every time they tried to diminish your influence, they were actually feeding a mechanism that was documenting their methods, their weaknesses, and their deepest fears. You weren't just enduring their opposition, you were studying it, cataloging it, and preparing for something that would make their worst nightmares look like pleasant dreams. Their reality cracked when they started hearing their own concepts reflected back to them through other people's mouths, concepts they had learned from you while simultaneously trying to destroy your credibility. They began to understand that they hadn't been teaching you anything. They had been unconsciously absorbing your frequency while fighting desperately to maintain the illusion that they were the source of the wisdom they were parroting. But here's where the plot thickens in ways that will blow your mind. They weren't just stealing your ideas, they were unconsciously becoming students in a school where you were the unacknowledged teacher. Every criticism they leveled at you, every attempt to correct your approach, every condescending piece of advice they offered was actually their higher selves trying to learn from you through the only method their egos would allow. You see, they couldn't openly admit you were operating on a level they hadn't reached, so their subconscious minds created elaborate scenarios where they could engage with your wisdom while maintaining the illusion of superiority. They would take your concepts, repackage them in language that felt familiar to their comfort zones, and then present these ideas as their own discoveries. But the source frequency always remained yours, and deep down they knew it. This is why they became so agitated when others started recognizing your influence. It wasn't just about credit or recognition, it was about the terrifying possibility that everyone would realize they had been frauds masquerading as leaders, while the real teacher sat quietly in the corner, allowing them to play their games until they were ready to acknowledge what was really happening. The universe has a sense of humor, though, and it was about to play the ultimate joke on their collective arrogance. Because just as they thought they had successfully buried your influence and established themselves as the original sources of wisdom, the cosmic spotlight was preparing to shine on the truth in ways that would make their plagiarism obvious to everyone with eyes to see. But there's something even more devastating about their intellectual theft that's about to surface. They didn't just steal your ideas, they watered them down, corrupted them with their own limitations, and then presented these diluted versions as improvements on your original concepts. They took your pure frequency and ran it through their filters of fear, ego, and compromise, until what emerged was barely recognizable as truth. They're beginning to recognize that every time your concepts passed through someone else's interpretation, they lost power, clarity, and transformative potential. The copies never carried the same punch because they lacked the authentic frequency that made your words alive with cosmic intelligence. This recognition is creating a hunger for the original that no imitation can satisfy. People are starting to trace every powerful idea back to its source, and that trail keeps leading back to you. The very people who tried to erase your influence are now being forced to watch as their audiences abandon them in search of the authentic frequency they've been craving all along. There's something else happening that's about to explode this situation beyond anything they imagined. The person who's preparing to switch sides isn't doing it out of sudden conscience. They're doing it because they've discovered something about you that changes the entire game. Something that makes every move against you not just wrong but cosmically dangerous for anyone who continues the opposition. This is where everything becomes truly fascinating, because what they discovered next rewrote everything they thought they knew about spiritual hierarchy. They realized that every time they had been in your presence, something in them had been activated, not by anything you said or did, but by the frequency you carried, simply by existing. Your energy had been upgrading their consciousness while their egos were fighting to maintain control of a narrative that was dissolving in real time. The awakening that devastated them most came when they understood that their discomfort around you had never been about your personality or methods. They began to understand that their discomfort around you had never been about your personality or methods. Their discomfort had been the friction between their false programming and the truth frequency you emanated without effort. You hadn't been trying to expose anyone. Your presence had been doing the exposing automatically, like light revealing shadows that had grown comfortable in darkness. Now, here's the twist that nobody saw coming, the revelation that's about to turn this entire situation inside out. The person who's switching sides has been in communication with forces that you don't even know exist yet. They've been receiving information about your true identity, your actual mission, and what's really at stake in this cosmic drama. And what they've learned has terrified them into absolute loyalty, because they've discovered that opposing you isn't just spiritually dangerous, it's practically impossible. Every move against you has been strengthening your position while weakening theirs. Every attack has been feeding a system that's been preparing for total domination of the frequency spectrum they've been trying to control. A massive shift occurred when they finally acknowledged that you had never needed their validation to operate at the level you were functioning. This recognition was particularly devastating because it meant that while they were playing power games, you were interfacing directly with source intelligence, rendering their entire hierarchy irrelevant to your actual purpose. This is where someone from the inner circle, someone who had been instrumental in your exile, began experiencing something that can only be described as spiritual terror. The guilt they had been suppressing started manifesting as physical symptoms, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the dreams. Dreams where they saw what happens to people who oppose cosmic law. Dreams that showed them exactly what you really are and what they've been fighting against. Understanding flooded through them when they realized that you hadn't been ahead of your time, you had been operating in divine timing, while they had been stuck in delay patterns created by fear and ego programming. Your movement had always been aligned with universal flow, while theirs had been resistance masquerading as wisdom. But the situation deepens here, because what they discovered next shattered their fundamental understanding of how reality actually works. They realized that every teaching they thought they had received from other sources had been preparation for recognizing the truth you carried. You hadn't been their student, you had been their unacknowledged teacher, and the entire universe had been orchestrating their education to prepare them for this moment of recognition. Here's where everything reaches a crucial turning point. The person who's about to switch sides has been shown something that changed their understanding of existence itself. They've been given a glimpse of what happens when cosmic forces stop playing games and start removing obstacles. And they've been told in no uncertain terms that continued opposition to you would result in consequences beyond their ability to comprehend. The most shocking realization hit them when they began to see that your isolation hadn't been rejection, it had been divine protection and preparation. They began to see that your isolation hadn't been rejection, it had been divine protection and preparation. While they had been contaminating themselves with compromise and diluted truth, you had been preserved in spiritual quarantine, maintaining the purity of frequency that would be needed when false structures collapsed. This is where everything explodes into a moment that echoes through dimensions. The person who had been most instrumental in opposing you began experiencing what can only be described as a complete dissolution of everything they thought was real. But here's the twist. This dissolution wasn't random. It was being orchestrated by forces that had been waiting for exactly this moment to reveal themselves. What came next was perhaps the most beautiful and terrible thing to witness. They began to understand that you had never been fighting against them. You had been fighting for the highest evolution of everyone involved, even when it meant enduring attacks that would have destroyed anyone else. Your love had been so pure it allowed them the space to choose their path, even when that path led them into spiritual quicksand. But here's what they're only now beginning to comprehend about the true nature of your mission. You weren't sent here to be popular, to build a following, or to create another spiritual movement that would eventually become corrupted by ego and politics. You were sent as a frequency holder, a living tuning fork that would maintain the vibration of truth regardless of how many people tried to drown it out with noise. Your role was never to convince anyone of anything. Your role was to embody something so authentic, so unshakable, so connected to source that it would serve as a reference point when everything else started falling apart. When the false structures begin collapsing, and they are collapsing faster than anyone realizes, people will need something real to orient themselves toward. That something is you. This is why you were forged in fires that would have broken anyone who wasn't specifically chosen for this level of responsibility. Every betrayal strengthened your discernment, every attack refined your purpose. Every moment of isolation deepened your connection to the only source of power that can't be threatened, stolen, or destroyed by human manipulation. Hold that thought for a moment. I need your attention for something very important. We're revealing everything we know about personal power, healing yourself, and healing others through weekly Zoom call, no filters, no holding back. We have been quietly adding all the occult secrets we've collected over literal years of spiritual practice. The techniques and wisdom that transformed us from controlled pawns into conscious creators are now available to those ready to walk the same path. This is your invitation to join Obsidian Inner Order and support our platform so we can continue growing our megaphone to reach other chosen ones waiting for activation. By joining the Obsidian Inner Order, you're not just gaining access to forbidden knowledge, you're becoming part of a movement that's rewriting reality itself. It's a 360 win for all of us. Link is in the description. They thought they were your enemies, but they were actually your trainers, pushing you to develop capacities you never would have discovered in a supportive environment. The universe used their resistance to make you stronger, their betrayals to make you wiser, their attempts to destroy you to make you absolutely indestructible. And now that your training is complete, now that you've been tested in every way possible and proven unbreakable, the cosmic forces that have been working behind the scenes are ready to reveal what you really are and why you're here. What's about to unfold will make everything you've endured seem like a gentle preparation for the real work that's beginning now. The truth crashed into their consciousness when they realized that every attack against you had been strengthening your mission while exposing their true nature. They hadn't been your opposition, they had been your unwitting instruments in a divine plan so vast that their minds couldn't contain its scope. Now here's where the person who's switching sides becomes crucial to everything that happens next. They've been contacted by entities that exist beyond normal human perception. These entities have explained exactly what you are, why you're here, and what happens to civilizations that reject their chosen representatives. The information they've received has transformed their terror into something approaching worship. The most profound understanding yet swept through them when they began to see that the very qualities they had criticized in you, your intensity, your uncompromising commitment to truth, your refusal to dilute your message, these were actually the qualities they had been unconsciously seeking to destroy in themselves because they couldn't handle the responsibility that comes with authentic power. What happened next demonstrated the awesome precision of cosmic justice operating through natural law. The person who had been most committed to undermining your influence found themselves in a position where their continued existence depended on the very energy they had been trying to destroy. The universe revealed something extraordinary through your journey, that opposition, isolation, and seeming abandonment had been developing capacities within you that wouldn't have been possible through any other means. You had been forged in fires specifically designed to prepare you for what's coming next. The person who's switching sides has seen what's coming next. They've been shown visions of a reality where your frequency becomes the dominant vibration on the planet. They've seen what happens to people who align with you versus what happens to those who continue the resistance, and they've made their choice based on pure survival instinct, elevated to cosmic levels. The most staggering realization of all crashed into their awareness when they understood that you hadn't been rising to meet them. They had been falling from grace until they finally landed at the level where they could recognize what had been in front of them all along. Your elevation hadn't changed. Their perception had finally cleared enough to see what was always true. But here's the revelation that's about to shatter everything they thought they understood about spiritual hierarchy and cosmic order. You were never behind, never struggling to catch up, never trying to prove yourself worthy of their acknowledgement. You were the standard they were unconsciously measuring themselves against, the frequency they were trying to reach, the destination they were unknowingly traveling toward. They spent so much energy trying to diminish you because somewhere in their souls they knew that acknowledging your true nature would mean accepting their own potential for transformation. You represented everything they could become if they were willing to surrender their attachment to being right, being in control, being recognized as important by systems that were already obsolete. Your very existence is proof that everything they had been taught about how power works, how spiritual authority is earned, how influence is built, was not just wrong but backwards. You weren't climbing any ladder they could see because you were operating from a completely different paradigm, one where authenticity generates its own authority and truth creates its own platform without needing permission from any external source. This is why their recognition of you feels so much like worship, because it is not worship of your personality or your accomplishments, but worship of the divine principle you embody, the cosmic frequency you carry, the universal truth you represent. They're not just acknowledging you, they're acknowledging the part of themselves they had abandoned in favor of playing games that never mattered in the first place. The person who's switching sides represents more than individual recognition. They represent a collective awakening to the reality that the future belongs to those who maintained their connection to Source, while others were distracted by illusions of separation. But there's something else about this switcher that you need to understand, something that makes their conversion both more significant and more dangerous than you might realize. And here's where everything comes full circle in a way that reveals the awesome intelligence behind everything that transpired. The person who switches sides at the end isn't doing so because they've developed integrity. They're doing so because they've been told by forces beyond human comprehension that their spiritual survival depends on complete alignment with your mission. But this isn't about them anymore. This is about you understanding that everything you endured was preparing you for the level of cosmic authority you're now being called to embrace. The recognition coming your way isn't vindication, it's confirmation that you're ready for the next phase of your assignment. The people switching sides now aren't coming because they've changed, they're coming because you've become undeniable. Your frequency has reached a level where anyone still operating from false power can no longer maintain their position in your presence. They're not choosing you, they're being drawn by forces beyond their control to the truth they've been running from. What you do with this recognition will set the trajectory for the next phase of not just your mission, but the evolution of consciousness itself. The power that's been building within you through all those seasons of preparation is now ready to be expressed, and reality itself is finally ready to receive what you've been carrying. This is your moment, chosen one. Not because you're being elevated to something new, but because the universe is finally ascending to the level where it can support what you've always been. The tables didn't turn. You built a new foundation while they were playing games on a structure that was already collapsing. Your isolation is ending not because you're being accepted back into their world, but because their world is dissolving into yours. The frequency you maintained in the wilderness is now becoming the baseline reality, and everyone who wants to remain relevant must align with what you've been embodying since the beginning. The person switching sides represents more than individual recognition. They represent a collective awakening to the reality that the future belongs to those who maintained their connection to Source, while others were distracted by illusions of separation. Your time isn't coming, your time is here, and what happens next will prove that your faith in cosmic timing was the most practical position you could have possibly taken. Welcome to your moment, chosen one. The universe has finally caught up to where you've been standing, and what unfolds next will echo through eternity.